In the small town of Oak Ridge, the police officers began their day as usual. The town was quiet, and the streets were calm. The routine of patrols checking in with dispatch and responding to minor calls was all they knew. It had been like this for years, and they were content with the peace they helped maintain. Each officer had their role to play in the day's work, from the young rookie still learning the ropes to the seasoned veterans who had seen it all. There was a sense of order and purpose in the air. They knew the rules of the game, and they played by them without question. But what they didn't know was that there was a force much bigger than their daily tasks that was quietly watching and waiting from the shadows. The local congressman, who represented Oak Ridge, had always been a distant figure in the eyes of the officers. He attended a few public events now and then gave speeches and made occasional appearances. But to them, he was just another politician, a name on a list. They never thought much about his influence or what he could do for them. They were too focused on the here and now, the immediate threats and challenges they faced on the streets. They didn't see the bigger picture. They didn't realize that this congressman held the power to shape the very foundation of their department, from the funding they received to the policies that governed their work. It was all connected to decisions he made in Washington, but those connections were invisible to the officers, and that's how they liked it. They preferred to operate in their own world, where they were the ones in charge, where the chain of command was simple and clear, and the only thing that mattered was their ability to keep the peace. It was a world of certainty, one that allowed them to focus on their duties without distractions. The congressman's role in their day-to-day lives seemed irrelevant, but this complacency would not last for long. As the officers went about their morning routine, the town's atmosphere began to shift just slightly, but enough to be noticed by those who were paying attention. There had been whispers about budget cuts and new policies coming from the state level. The officers didn't take much note of it at first. After all, they had been through budget cuts before, and they had always found a way to make it work. But this time something felt different. The conversations at the precinct grew more tense, and the usual confidence in their abilities began to waver. The officers knew that something wasn't quite right, but no one could put their finger on it. The chief of police had been unusually quiet during the morning briefing. His normally firm voice was laced with hesitation and uncertainty. The officers exchanged glances, but said nothing. They were all thinking the same thing. Something was changing, and they didn't know what it was yet. The rumors of funding cuts were confirmed later in the week, when the department was notified that they would need to operate on a much tighter budget for the upcoming year. The officers were concerned, but they figured it was just a temporary setback. They had dealt with budget cuts before and always managed to carry on. But this time was different. The cuts were more severe, and there was no room for negotiation. The officers didn't know who was behind the decision, but they were frustrated. They felt the sting of these new restrictions, and the pressure began to mount as they scrambled to figure out how they would continue to do their jobs with fewer resources and less support. They hadn't yet connected the dots. They didn't know that the congressman, who had been silent through it all, was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. They didn't know that the budget cuts were the result of decisions he had made far away in Washington. They didn't understand the power he held over their department and how his influence could make or break their ability to do their jobs. But that would soon change as the weeks passed and the situation worsened. The officers would begin to realize that their world was not as simple as they had thought. The lines of authority ran deeper than they ever imagined, and the man they had overlooked was the key to everything they took for granted. As the weeks went by, the frustration among the officers grew. The budget cuts had started to take a visible toll on the department. Resources were thinning, and the strain on the officers was beginning to show. The calls came in faster than they could respond to, and every shift felt longer than the last. The patrol cars were running low on supplies, and equipment was starting to break down. The officers began to feel the weight of the situation, but they still didn't know who to blame for this sudden change. Their frustration was directed at their local government and the county commissioners, but they had no idea that the congressman had been the one behind these cuts. It wasn't personal to them. The congressman had always been a figure in the background. They had never paid much attention to him, and his speeches at town halls never sparked much interest for any of them. To be honest, the officers saw him as someone who talked a lot about national issues and seemed out of touch with what was happening on the ground in Oak Ridge. He was just another politician to them. So when the news about the budget cuts broke out, the officers assumed it was just another unfortunate decision made by those in higher offices, somewhere far away from their reality. They had no reason to believe that the congressman, who was rarely seen in town, could have anything to do with their daily struggles at first. There were a few whispers among the officers. One or two of them started to suspect that the congressman might have some influence over the budget, but they quickly dismissed the idea as paranoia. The thought of a man they barely knew being the cause of their department's financial hardship seemed absurd. It didn't fit the narrative they had constructed in their minds about how things worked. They had always believed that their jobs were shaped by the local politics of Oak Ridge and the immediate decisions made by the town council. So when it was revealed that the congressman had actually been the one to approve these drastic cuts, their disbelief was palpable. It came to light in an unexpected way during a routine meeting at the precinct. The chief had just finished a briefing about the budget when he paused and cleared his throat. He hesitated for a moment before he finally spoke. "The congressman has been instrumental in securing the cuts," he said, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The officers were stunned. Some of them exchanged confused glances. Others felt their stomachs drop as the reality began to sink in. The congressman, the man they had never really paid attention to, had been the one making decisions that directly affected their department. The realization hit hard. It felt like a slap in the face. How could they have been so blind? How could they have missed the signs that the very man they had ignored all along had the power to control their department's future? The chief continued explaining how the congressman had worked behind the scenes to push for the cuts as part of a larger political agenda that was playing out on the state level and beyond. The officers listened in stunned silence. Some felt betrayed by their ignorance, while others felt a deep sense of anger. They had been fighting an invisible enemy this whole time, and now that they knew who it was, it felt like a wake-up call. They had been too focused on their own routines to consider that there were larger forces at play beyond their control. The department's operations were now being shaped by a political figure who had been watching from the sidelines all along without them even realizing it. The news spread quickly throughout the precinct, and the officers began to question everything they had taken for granted. The congressman wasn't just a distant figurehead. He was the one pulling the strings, and they were left to pick up the pieces of his decisions. But still, they had no idea what the full impact of his actions would be. They had only just begun to understand the depth of his power and how it could change everything they thought they knew about their work. The realization hit the officers like a wave crashing against the shore. They had spent years in their small town thinking they knew everything about the way their world operated, yet here was this congressman, a figure they had never taken seriously, controlling the very resources they relied on to do their jobs. And now they were left to figure out how to move forward with the knowledge that they had been completely unaware of the power he held over their department. At first, there was confusion as they processed the news. The officers gathered in small groups during breaks to discuss what had just been revealed. Some were angry, feeling that they had been deceived, while others were shocked at how easily they had been manipulated into thinking their struggles were the result of simple budget cuts. The realization that their daily operations were affected by someone they had never really considered opened their eyes to the hidden layers of power that existed beyond the precinct doors. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and for a few days, the department was in a state of disbelief. No one seemed to know how to handle the new reality. The congressman was not just a distant figure anymore. He was the reason they had been struggling to keep up with the demands of the job. His decisions had set everything into motion, and the officers now found themselves caught in the consequences of a game they had never even known they were playing. But it didn't take long for the anger to turn into action. The officers knew they couldn't just sit back and accept their fate. They needed to do something. But what could they do against a man with so much power in the state legislature, who had the resources and political clout to affect every part of their department, from funding to policies? They had no idea where to start or how to even approach the situation. It wasn't like they could march to the congressman's office and demand answers. It was a delicate situation, and they were caught in the middle of a political web that extended far beyond the borders of Oak Ridge. They were just one small department in one small town, and the congressman was dealing with far bigger issues than a group of frustrated police officers. Yet the officers also realized that if they didn't find a way to make their voices heard, their problems would only grow worse. They couldn't afford to let this situation slip through the cracks or allow their frustrations to simmer without a plan. They began to look for ways to connect with other local leaders who might have similar concerns with the congressman's influence. One of the younger officers suggested reaching out to the press to raise awareness about the situation, while others felt more inclined to gather local community support. They needed leverage, and they needed it fast, so they could put pressure on the congressman to reverse the cuts and start working with them instead of against them. But there was a problem. They didn't know how the congressman would respond. They had no idea whether he would even care about their complaints, or if he would dismiss them like he had dismissed their needs in the past. The congressman was a politician who had a reputation for being distant from the concerns of small-town law enforcement. But that didn't mean he couldn't be swayed by public opinion. They had to play it carefully. It was clear now that their department's survival depended on more than just policing skills. It depended on political maneuvering, on understanding the web of connections and relationships that held Oak Ridge's future in the balance. They couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The congressman's decisions had already altered the course of their department, and if they wanted things to change, they would have to learn to navigate a world they had never been trained for. They would need to become more than just officers on the street. They would need to become savvy players in a game of politics they hadn't even known they were part of until now. And as they began to form a strategy, they realized something else. They were no longer just fighting for resources or a budget. They were fighting for their own place in the power structure that controlled everything they had taken for granted. And the real battle was only just beginning. As the days passed, the officers began to piece together their plan. They knew they couldn't take on the congressman alone, so they started to reach out to other local leaders in Oak Ridge to see if they shared their frustrations. Some were surprised to hear about the congressman's role in the budget cuts. Others had heard the rumors, but had no idea how deeply involved he was. And yet, as the conversation spread, the officers began to realize that they weren't the only ones affected by these political decisions. Local schools were facing cuts to their safety programs. Local social services were stretched thin, and even the fire department was struggling to keep up with its own increasing demands. The town was feeling the ripple effects of a much larger issue, and the officers knew they couldn't just sit back and let it continue. They began organizing small meetings with local business owners, school representatives, and members of the community who relied on the department's services. They knew that in order to make an impact, they would need to unite the voices of Oak Ridge into a force that could challenge the congressman's decisions. It wasn't going to be easy, but the officers had no choice. If they wanted to fix their department, they had to start with fixing the town's perception of the problems that were so often hidden behind closed doors. These efforts were not without resistance. At first, some of the community members were skeptical, unsure if the officers could actually make a difference, or if the congressman would even listen to a group like theirs. But the officers were persistent, and as the weeks passed, more and more people started to rally behind their cause. The message became clear to the congressman that his actions were being felt all over Oak Ridge. The pressure was starting to build, and the town was no longer staying silent. The officers met with local press to share their story, hoping that putting public pressure on the congressman would force him to take notice. But even then, they didn't know how he would respond. He was a seasoned politician with years of experience in handling public relations, and he had the resources to deflect their accusations if he wanted to. But still, the officers were determined. They believed that if enough people knew the truth about what was happening behind the scenes, the congressman's power would begin to wane. The first major break came when a local news outlet published a story detailing the effects of the cuts on the department and the town as a whole. It wasn't just about the officers, it was about the entire community, and how the congressman's decisions had affected everyone from local teachers to the elderly and the vulnerable. When the story went live, the response was immediate. People took to social media to share their thoughts, and soon the pressure on the congressman began to grow. As the story spread beyond Oak Ridge's borders, the officers couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. But they also knew the real challenge was just beginning. They had managed to expose the problem, but now they needed to ensure that something would change. They couldn't afford to let the congressman sweep this under the rug. They had to keep pushing, keep making noise. They knew that if they stopped now, all their hard work would be for nothing. It was a delicate balance, and no one knew exactly how the congressman would respond to the growing public outcry. Would he double down on his decisions, or would he finally listen to the people he had ignored for so long? The officers had their doubts, but they also knew they had gained something important. They had gained momentum, and the town was starting to rally behind them. The congressman's control over the department's fate was no longer invisible, and for the first time in years, the officers felt like they had a real chance to take back some of the power that had been stripped away from them. They just had to be ready for whatever came next, and whatever the congressman decided to do next would determine whether they had won this battle or whether the real fight was still to come. The pressure continued to mount as the officers saw the community rallying behind their cause. The town of Oak Ridge had begun to shift in ways they hadn't anticipated. Local businesses were voicing their concerns in town hall meetings. Local residents were reaching out to their neighbors, encouraging them to speak up. Even those who had once been indifferent to the department's struggles now saw how the cuts were affecting their daily lives. The officers knew they had to capitalize on this growing support and keep the momentum going. But they also knew that the congressman wasn't one to back down easily. He had built a career on managing public opinion and political pressure, and they couldn't underestimate his ability to maintain control in the face of a challenge. With each passing day, the officers found themselves balancing the escalating demands of their jobs with the mounting pressure to confront the congressman. They were still expected to respond to calls and patrol the streets. Even as the weight of the political battle grew heavier on their shoulders, they felt torn between the responsibility to their community and the fight for their department's survival. They were no longer just officers of the law. They were becoming activists in a battle that they never expected to face. But the stakes were high, and they couldn't afford to give up. The town continued to grow restless. As the congressman stayed silent, his office deflected calls from local media outlets and avoided direct interviews with reporters, while his supporters in the state government backed his decisions and defended his actions in public. The officers knew they couldn't rely on the congressman's office to suddenly change their position, so they turned their attention to a different strategy. They needed to pressure him directly by showing that the public outcry wasn't just a temporary wave, but a sustained movement that couldn't be ignored. So they organized a massive rally at the town square. They reached out to community leaders, local activists, and even some sympathetic state officials to show up and lend their voices. The event was intended to be peaceful, but loud, a demonstration of unity against the budget cuts and the congressman's role in pushing them through. They knew that it had to be big enough to make waves if they were going to send a clear message that the people of Oak Ridge would no longer tolerate being ignored. The night before the rally, the officers met in a local diner to prepare for the following day. The mood was tense but hopeful. Everyone knew that tomorrow would be a turning point. Either they would succeed in forcing the congressman to confront the consequences of his decisions, or the battle would stretch on for much longer than they were prepared for. There was uncertainty in the air, but the officers knew that they couldn't back down now. They had already come too far to let their efforts go to waste. When the rally began the next day, it quickly became clear that the community was fully invested. People from all walks of life came together, standing side by side, holding signs and chanting for change. The officers walked through the crowd, meeting with their supporters and feeling the strength of the unity around them. They felt the power of what they had started. It was no longer just about resources for their department. It was about the town of Oak Ridge taking control of its own future and demanding that its leaders listen to the people who elected them. The rally attracted local news stations who began broadcasting the event live, and soon social media was flooded with posts and hashtags supporting the officers and their cause. The pressure on the congressman grew heavier as the day wore on, but he remained silent, not responding to the growing wave of criticism from his constituents in Oak Ridge and beyond. The officers had done everything they could to bring the town together, to show the congressman that this wasn't just about a few angry officers. It was about the will of an entire community who had grown tired of being treated like an afterthought. But now they faced a new challenge. Would the congressman finally step up and address the public outcry, or would he continue to ignore them and risk further alienating the people he was supposed to represent? It was a pivotal moment. The officers had thrown everything into this fight, But the real question was whether they could keep the pressure on long enough to force the change they so desperately needed. They could only hope that the congressman would finally see the power of the people and be forced to respond. But even if he did, the officers knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, and they would need to remain vigilant if they were going to protect the future of their department and the town they had sworn to serve. As the rally faded and the crowds dispersed, the officers found themselves in a state of uneasy anticipation. They had put everything on the line, and now all they could do was wait. The silence from the congressman was deafening. His office continued to deflect media inquiries, and he had yet to make any public statements about the cuts or the rally that had so powerfully echoed throughout Oak Ridge. The officers felt a mix of frustration and determination. They had thought that by organizing such a massive show of support, it would force his hand, but so far it seemed as though he was intent on holding his ground. They met the following morning at the precinct, some exhausted from the rally, some filled with a renewed sense of purpose, but all uncertain about what to do next. It was clear that the congressman had a political strategy. He was playing a long game and wasn't going to be swayed by a single protest or even by a town full of discontent. It was the kind of tactic they had expected from someone like him who had spent years maneuvering through the political system. But even as they discussed their next steps, a growing sense of unease began to settle over them. The more they looked at the situation, the more they realized that their town's future wasn't just at the mercy of the congressman's decisions. It was also at the mercy of the political games he played on a larger stage. It wasn't enough to just confront him locally. They had to find a way to hit him where it hurt. They knew they had the support of Oak Ridge behind them. But the real test was whether they could leverage that support into something that could actually force change. So the officers started reaching out to people who might have the resources and political connections to help them amplify their message. They reached out to state officials sympathetic to their cause, local activists with a larger platform, and even some national organizations that focused on police funding and public safety. It was a strategy that felt like a long shot, but they knew that it was their best option if they wanted to get the congressman's attention. It wasn't long before their efforts began to pay off. Several prominent news outlets picked up the story of Oak Ridge's struggle, and soon the press started digging deeper into the congressman's voting record and his history with law enforcement. Funding their investigation uncovered some startling facts that helped to paint a picture of the congressman as someone who had consistently pushed for cuts to public services in rural areas, all in the name of budget balancing. It wasn't just Oak Ridge that had suffered. It was other towns and cities across the state that had seen their budgets slashed with no regard for the impact on their communities. It was this story that began to turn the tide. The congressman had been able to deflect the spotlight on him for weeks, but now the media scrutiny was growing, and his ties to the cuts were becoming undeniable. People began to see the larger picture. They understood that the congressman's decisions were not just an isolated issue in Oak Ridge. They were part of a larger pattern that affected communities across the state and the country. Soon the pressure began to mount on the congressman from all sides, and it wasn't just coming from Oak Ridge. It was coming from the very people who had once supported him but were now starting to question his priorities. As public outrage grew, the congressman's office finally made a statement. It was a carefully crafted response, attempting to deflect blame and downplay the impact of the cuts. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The officers knew it wasn't a victory yet, but it was the first real sign that their efforts had been successful. The congressman had been forced to acknowledge them and to address the issue publicly. The officers met once again in the precinct, but this time there was a different energy in the air. They had faced defeat after defeat, but now they had finally cracked the surface of something much larger than themselves. They had created a movement that had not only gotten the congressman's attention, but had also sparked a larger conversation about the funding of public services and the impact of budget cuts on small towns and local law enforcement. They knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they were on the path to real change. And no matter how hard the battle ahead might be, they were ready to face it head-on, knowing they had the support of their town and the growing power of the truth on their side. The congressman's statement was only the beginning. The officers knew that although he had finally addressed the issue publicly, it was far from an acknowledgement of responsibility. In fact, his words were vague and defensive, offering little more than an empty promise to reassess the funding, but not to reverse the cuts. It was clear to the officers that the battle was far from over. They had won the first round by forcing the congressman to make a public statement, but now they had to make sure that the momentum didn't fade. They had come too far to let things slip back into the shadows again. So they doubled down and began organizing a series of town halls across Oak Ridge, where they would continue to press the congressman to take real action. They invited the public to participate in these meetings, hoping that by showing the congressman that the people of Oak Ridge weren't going to back down, they could apply even more pressure on him and hold him accountable. The first town hall was packed. The room was filled with residents who had never before attended a political event, but now felt the urgency to make their voices heard. The officers stood at the front and took turns speaking about how the cuts were directly affecting their ability to keep Oak Ridge safe and how they needed a resolution quickly to restore the department's funding. The residents spoke passionately, sharing stories of how the department had helped them in the past, how it had been an integral part of their community, and how the cuts had shaken their sense of security. The congressman was invited to attend, but he sent a representative in his place. It was a move that only fueled the growing frustration among the town's residents. They saw it as another sign that he didn't take them seriously, that he was still hiding behind bureaucracy instead of facing the people he had let down in person. The representative who stood in for the congressman was well prepared, but lacked the sincerity the people of Oak Ridge needed to hear. The empty words he spoke did nothing to calm the rising anger in the room. The officers could feel the energy shifting as the crowd became more vocal and more determined. The town wasn't going to be brushed off this time. The officers knew that they had reached a tipping point. If they could keep this momentum going and continue to mobilize the community, there was a chance they could force the congressman to meet with them face to face and make real concessions. They spent the next several weeks coordinating with local activists, business owners, and educators to keep the pressure on. They didn't stop organizing rallies and meetings. They kept the conversation alive in the media through local news outlets and social media platforms. They knew they needed to keep their story at the forefront of people's minds or risk losing the ground they had gained. There were moments of doubt, of course. Some days it felt like they weren't getting anywhere. The congressman's office remained tight-lipped and continued to deflect any requests for meetings. But with each rally and each public outcry, the officers could see the cracks beginning to form in the congressman's carefully constructed image. People were beginning to realize that this wasn't just about the police department. This was about the well-being of the entire town. Oak Ridge wasn't going to sit by and let its needs be ignored any longer. Word began to spread beyond Oak Ridge's borders as more local governments began to question the congressman's funding priorities. Other communities in the state began to take notice, and a movement started to form outside of their small town. It wasn't just the officers and the people of Oak Ridge fighting anymore. They had sparked a conversation that resonated with others who had been similarly affected by the congressman's decisions. And as the pressure continued to build, the officers knew that they had a real chance to make a lasting change. They had started with a small idea, a simple notion that they could make their voices heard. But now they were part of something much bigger, something that could change the way politicians approached public funding for years to come. They weren't just fighting for their department anymore. They were fighting for the future of their town and the larger communities that had been silenced for too long. The officers could see the writing on the wall. The congressman couldn't continue to ignore them much longer. It was only a matter of time before he would be forced to come to the table. And when that moment came, they had to be ready. They had to be unified and strong, ready to negotiate and demand the changes that Oak Ridge so desperately needed. The congressman's day of reckoning finally arrived, and the officers knew that the time for talk was over. It had been weeks of planning, organizing, and relentless pressure on his office, but now he had no choice but to face the consequences of his decisions. The moment they had been pushing for had come, and they could feel the weight of it in the air. They gathered in the town hall once again. But this time the stakes were higher. It wasn't just a meeting of frustrated citizens. This was the moment when they would demand real change, when they would make sure that their voices were no longer ignored. The officers stood at the front of the room, their faces determined but weary from the months of struggle. They had seen their town rally behind them, and now they had to see that momentum turn into action. They had fought for so long, and through so many challenges, that it felt almost surreal to be standing there, knowing that the congressman had finally agreed to meet with them. In person, the doors opened, and the congressman walked in flanked by his advisors and staff. The room fell silent as he took his seat across from the officers and the community leaders who had helped them get this far. His presence seemed out of place. It felt almost like a final test to see if he would really listen to the people who had once been his most loyal supporters. But there was no mistaking the tension in the room. He was no longer in control. The officers had stripped him of that power, and the weight of his responsibility was now fully on his shoulders. The meeting began with the officers outlining the very real impact that the cuts had had on their ability to serve the town. The stories from the community poured out as residents shared their experiences of how the lack of resources had led to delayed responses, reduced patrols, and a general sense of insecurity in the town. The congressman sat silently listening, but his expression remained stoic. He offered little in the way of acknowledgement, and continued to deflect responsibility on the cuts to broader budgetary concerns. But the officers didn't let him off the hook. They had prepared for this moment. They had the facts on their side, and they weren't going to let him escape with vague answers. They pressed him again and again, asking him to take accountability for the cuts and their consequences, and to commit to restoring the funding that had been slashed in the first place. But it wasn't just about the funding anymore. It was about the message they sent to the community. They needed to hear that their voices mattered and that they wouldn't be ignored again. The congressman continued to sidestep their questions, but the pressure in the room was palpable. The officers saw the shift in his demeanor as the town's leaders pushed harder, and the public's frustration mounted. The congressman's mask was slipping. He could no longer pretend that this was just another small-town issue that would blow over. The town of Oak Ridge had changed the dynamic of the conversation. They had forced him into a corner where his only option was to either admit his mistakes or face the consequences of further alienating his constituents. The turning point came when one of the local business owners stood up and addressed the congressman directly. With a calm but firm voice, she explained how her business had been affected by the lack of police presence, and how it was affecting not only the safety of her employees, but also the livelihoods of the people who depended on her store. The emotional weight of her words hit everyone in the room, including the congressman. For the first time, he seemed to waver, and the officers knew that this was their moment. They pressed harder, bringing up specific examples of how the cuts had impacted the most vulnerable people in their community. They spoke not just as police officers, but as members of the town they had sworn to protect, and as citizens who believed in the power of the people to make their voices heard. The congressman's resistance finally broke as he reluctantly agreed to work with them to find a way to restore funding for the department and to implement policies that would better support the needs of Oak Ridge moving forward. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was the start of something better. It was a concession that the town had been waiting for, and for the officers it was the culmination of everything they had fought for. From that day forward, Oak Ridge would never be the same again. The officers had not only reclaimed their department's future, they had reclaimed the power of the people to stand up for what was right. They had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the voice of a determined community could bring about real change. The battle was far from over, but it had shifted in their favor, and they were ready for whatever came next.